Good afternoon, everyone. It's a tough act to follow. Thanks, everybody, for sharing your amazing organizational stories and pitches. It was great. So my name is Sarah Rogi. I'm a board member of Global Washington. I'm a deputy director in the Global Policy and Advocacy Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the Gates Foundation has been investing in Global Washington since, I think, 2010. And the reason for that is, we spend a lot of time at the Gates Foundation outside of Seattle. But the reason why we've been such a great supporter of Global Washington's work is that it really represents bringing together kind of the best of our community, philanthropists, companies, NGOs, academic institutions, and it's why we continue to be a big supporter of their work. And this conference, I think, really is kind of the best of what Global Washington can do. So seeing everybody here in such record numbers is really inspiring. And so it gives me great pleasure to actually to introduce someone from the Gates Foundation who's doing probably one of the most important jobs that we have to confront as a community, and that's Sarah Hendricks, and she's the director of our Gender Equality Program at the Gates Foundation. Sarah's been at the foundation directing the Gender Equality Program since 2015. In her role as the director of Gender Equality, she leads the foundation's efforts to achieve substantive and sustainable results in promoting gender equality and unlocking the empowerment of women and girls. She also serves on the advisory board of Data 2X, working to improve the availability and accuracy of gender data, and is a board member at the Global Women's Institute Leadership Council. She was also named, which I thought this is one of my favorite things about what Sarah does, she was named one of the 100 most influential people in gender equality global policy by Apolitical. Prior to working at the Gates Foundation, Sarah also worked at Plan International and Women in the Law in Southern Africa. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sarah to come and speak to you and give our afternoon keynote. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It is fantastic to be with you today, and all the more so to follow what was an incredible round of fast pitch overviews, many of which struck on the topic of gender equality, many of which focused in on the lives of women and girls, both their power, their poverty, as well as their potential. And it's that thread that I'm hoping we can spend the next 15 or 20 minutes diving into right now. I wanted to begin, however, with a thought. And this is a quotation from Alice Walker, which says that the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. I think this is very appropriate to what I want to share with you today, because women and girls, especially in low-income settings around the world, sometimes are told by structures and systems that surround them that they don't have power. And yet we've just seen through these fast pitch explorations the many, many ways that women and girls do have power. The many, many ways that this power is and can be so transformative. And at the heart of the imbalance of inequity in this world, and especially as it relates to poverty, is the deep and persistent way that gender inequality connects with structures and systems that creates immense barriers for women and girls. I think these are barriers that can lift. We've seen stories today already about how they do lift. And I believe that when women and girls can both see their value, recognize the power they have in their lives, that it benefits not just them, but it benefits everyone. This is a subject that's incredibly personal to me. It's been a personal part of my life journey. It's been a personal part of why I have become a gender advocate, why I've dedicated myself to gender equality research, why I've been hyper-focused on how organizations change, to become more precise in the ways in which they tackle gender inequality in a substantive and more sustainable way. This journey for me actually started on December the 6th, but it was December the 6th a long time ago. It was December the 6th, 1989, and today's December the 6th. And December the 6th, 1989 was a pretty tough day in my country. That was the day when a man walked into l'École Polytechnique de Montréal, the Polytechnic College in Montreal, Canada. And he walked into a room of students who were learning to become engineers and scientists. And one by one, he picked out every single female face in that classroom, and he shot and murdered them. And he killed 14 women that day on December the 6th, 1989. 14 women who would have become some of my country's engineers, some of my country's brains behind science, math, and technology. And that was an important day for me as a 15-year-old. I was 15 at the time, and my 15-year-old self grappled with that event that day. And my 15-year-old self, I think, fundamentally changed how I saw the world, and fundamentally changed the ways in which I understood the constructs and the normative expectations of what women and girls are expected to be and to become. And it challenged my 15-year-old brain to think that there are different ways to be in this world, and that there's a different way to exercise power. And at that time, I believed as a woman that I could harness my own place in this world, the power that I have and my sense of purpose to challenge and change that reality and challenge and change that calculus for women. This is actually, this year, 2018, fast forward, I think, how many years is that? 29 years later. This is the year of the woman. And it's been a year of women marching around the world, raising their voices, asserting their power for their rights, for safety, for health, for their families. We've seen a lot of global traction around the Me Too movement. We've seen Rwanda and now recently Ethiopia rise up and become the first and second African nations to achieve gender parity in their cabinets. We've seen most recently in the US a record number of women to the US House of Representatives. In Canada, we saw advances in pay equity, in parental leave for women and men, in a mandate for gender parity in the Canadian cabinet. And I think we've seen a lot that has fueled and inspired many of us who work on gender equality. And that's almost like the air we breathe, those moments. That's the air you kind of suck into your lungs and take a big gulp of it, at least I do. You also know, as well as I do, that it will take many, many more years of the woman before we won't need to actually call out women's achievements, where women and girls will actually have equal status and power, the same as men and boys, the same as their male counterparts. And unfortunately, today, there's no country in the world where women and girls are equal to men. And it's this inequality, I think, that continues on even as we have significant advancements in technology, in innovation, in development, in health breakthroughs, in education, in market opportunities. Still, nevertheless, millions and millions of women and girls are being left behind. And part of that is the way in which poverty and inequality are so inextricably linked together. The ways in which the face of poverty is so often female, and how they are rooted not just in households, not just in the ways in which power operates in communities, but also in systems and structures, the ways in which those can and should be part of the solution. Women and girls face barriers, whether that's participating in the economy, earning their own money, having assets that they can make decisions about. in some cases, it can be pretty ingrained in systems themselves. Let me share with you one story. For many years, I lived in southern Africa, first in Zimbabwe and then in Malawi. I worked there, as was already told to you, for women in the law in southern Africa. And here I watched where women often lost their status and any power they had when they lost their husbands, i.e. when their husbands died. The years that I lived in Malawi was at the height of the HIV pandemic. It was at the height when we saw people in every program we rolled out dying every week. At that time, the average lifespan for an adult was 39 years. I'm 44. I would have already passed the average age at which adults lived. And when a woman's husband died, it was the custom, the entrenched normative custom, that his family would claim things in the house. This is called property dispossession. Even what seemed to be hers, whether that was clothing or a bicycle or cooking utensils or cash. Often it included the house and the land. I met hundreds of women working for women in the law who were forced empty-handed from their homes, kind of children in tow behind them, without kind of even just a pot to boil water. And it was the laws and policies that could and should have protected these women that actually had entrenched discrimination and exclusionary practices embedded with them as well. It was those laws and policies, and in fact the judicial system itself, that was either too costly or too distant or too foreign to actually aid women's access to justice. Women would have to walk, sometimes hours, to get to a primary justice delivery center. When they got there, it operated in English. When they got to the clerk, there was major paperwork to fill out. All this just to have access to the property that should rightfully be yours. The good news is, I think, that these long-standing barriers are starting to change. We're starting to see change over time. And I'd say some of that, for me anyways, is related to the ways in which the world is coming around gender equality as a critical and core solution to solving poverty, especially the inextricable link between poverty and inequality. You may not have seen the headlines about this year being the year of the woman, or you may not have seen that this is kind of women's empowerment is translating to real and important policy and social change. But what I'm hoping is that as the SDGs come to fruition, as we take steps around the world, that the situation I described in Malawi will be much more less likely in the future. More countries now than ever before actually have legal frameworks that address women and girls' rights. The SDGs, more than ever before, are presenting an unprecedented opportunity to actually tackle the roots of inequality, the drivers of inequality, not just the symptoms, what I often call the causes behind the causes of inequality. We're beginning to see what the author and activist Bell Hooks calls a practical model for social change that links the transformation of structures with the transformation of consciousness. That important coming together to change how we see power with how structures change and transform in society. I think the SDGs, and particularly SDG 5 and how it influences all the SDGs, are going to be core to that. And that these next 12 years of the SDGs are a critical opportunity for the Gates Foundation, for other organizations, to really challenge and change those symptoms and the drivers that underlie them to inequality. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the Gates Foundation's gender equality strategy. Earlier this year, we launched our strategy. In fact, we launched it on International Women's Day. And it's our first ever strategy dedicated specifically to gender. We're investing $170 million over the next 4 years to drive progress to SDG 5 and other SDGs, since they all have a gender dimension. Our approach is based on the promise that to achieve a healthier, greater world for everyone, we need to actually have a focused, tactical strategy on gender. Empowering women, of course, has always been at the heart of what the Gates Foundation has done. Whether that's initiatives focused on nutrition or on health or family planning or other areas that link directly to women's lives. But looking at the ways that poverty specifically impacts women and girls around our program areas, we realize we need to get really specific. We need to get really tactical. We need to have an overarching strategy that kind of goes head on with the unique barriers that women and girls face. And so then to inform our strategy, we conducted pretty rigorous research. We analyzed research in about 100 economies around the world to figure out what would it take to actually advance change, to take steps on gender equality. And we started that process acknowledging that there's no silver bullet, that there's no easy answer, that there's probably a million things you could invest in. And we wanted to focus on where we think there could be the greatest impact. And as we started to analyze that data across 100 economies, we saw one thing that kept emerging over and over again, and that is the role that economic power plays. The role that economic power plays to change the calculus of inequality and poverty. When a woman has a job, when a woman has an income, when she has her own bank account, when she can make decisions about saving and spending, when she can become a sophisticated financial transactor, she can exercise better control over her life. We've learned 3 main things that I want to share with you in building out our strategy. And I've highlighted some of these points already. The first is that the face of poverty is female. It is actually often young and female. Women and girls often shoulder the burden of poverty. Economies are certainly not automatically inclusive. And when a household faces an economic shock, when a household faces a hardship like a sick family member or the loss of a job, it is women and girls who suffer first. They often suffer in worse ways. They often recover last from that economic shock. We see the ways that women and girls are disproportionately affected by economic shocks in some pretty staggering statistics. And we see this, and I think it causes one to really pause and say, wow, the face of poverty is, in many cases, very female. Secondly, our second insight and learning was on the power of assets. That having assets actually enhances a woman's power and changes how she's seen. It can enhance her self-worth at home. It can change how society fundamentally sees her. I want to share with you, if you'll permit me, a piece of research that was really impactful as we built out this strategy. It was research that made me pause and reflect on how an asset in a woman's hand can be transformative. And this is a piece of research on the power of women having their own bank accounts. This is research that took place in India with a public works program that provides both women and men about 100 days of labor in any given year. This was randomized research in the context of a place where 1 in 3 married women often has no control over household spending on major purchases. This research study conducted by Harvard and Duke University showed that as women gained control over their own bank account, some pretty transformative things happened. They randomized this. Some women received their income from this job into what was called the household or family account. Most cases, this is an account held and owned by the male household leader of the family. In some rural households, The researchers worked with the government to open accounts for women themselves in their own name, and their wages were directed into their own accounts. What we saw was their earnings increased by 24%. Their likelihood to transition into the private sector increased by 11%. But what was fascinating to me is that their bargaining power in the household fundamentally changed. Women started to be able to push back against the social norms that defined what is expected of women, that defined how women work and the ways in which they are expected to not work. The point that I want to draw your attention to is that figure there. As women's financial control increased, the men in their households were 16% less likely to identify their wives as a housewife and instead identify her as an economic actor. Fundamentally, something changed in those households about the value of women, about the ways in which they hold power and the ways in which they are seen in society. My third point is that if we can lift economic barriers for women, we can actually unleash women's power over their lives. And I think that draws out from the research that I've just highlighted to you. This is truly what the data tells us. When women have access, control over economic power, when they can become more educated, they can actually choose when and whether to get married, when and whether to have children. They can actually drive social and economic and health gains for themselves and the next generation of girls. We've seen some pretty powerful research from McKinsey, which highlights that closing gender gaps in women's participation in economies and making that more equal can actually fundamentally change GDP itself. And that's really why we at the Gates Foundation are focusing in on women's economic empowerment. Fundamentally, our strategy is aiming to transform the ways that women participate in economies. It's looking at that in four main ways. We are going to invest that $170 million specifically in data and evidence to close the gender data gap. We're also working to enhance women's empowerment collectives to build up women's agency, voice, and knowledge. We're working to expand women's access to financial services as well as their connectedness into markets. And we're seeking to integrate a gender lens across everything we do, across the Foundation's programs so that gender stays front and center inside the Foundation. With a few minutes left, I'm getting a nod, let me tell you a little bit about each of these areas so that you have a sense of what it is the Foundation is going to be up to over these next 4 years. Firstly, on gender data and, evidence. Here, we're really focusing in on closing gender data gaps. We're going to continue to invest in collecting stronger data, building up evidence that tells us what works across countries so that we understand what barriers to focus in on. And then with a much more accurate picture, the Foundation and hopefully partners will be able to identify and lift up those barriers that hold women back. On women's empowerment collectives, this is really what I think of as self-help groups 2.0. We heard in one of the fast pitch talks about village savings and loans associations, VSLAs, or self-help groups. Imagine this is young women coming and gathering together to learn about banking, to learn about access to a job and skilling, to learn about budgeting, as well as to engage in supporting each other. We're trying to focus in with our resources on building on the collective models that already exist in India and Africa, and employ new technologies so that we can really boost young women's knowledge and power. In the area of financial services as well as market inclusion, this is really a big piece of the puzzle that we're diving into. With markets, we're focusing in on the global agricultural sector, since this is the main arena of employment for many poor rural women in the geographies where we work. With financial services for the poor, we're focusing in on digital finance. More and more people are accessing a mobile money account. Probably all of us here today send and receive money using our phones. And yet, in many countries around the world, that gender gap is still really, really persistent. And it's actually a gap that's growing. Even as usage grows in the world, that gap continues to grow. And I think we need really deliberate tactics to close that. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is to work with government social payments, really building on our expertise in financial services for the poor. Here, the foundation is going to work with governments in 8 countries around the world to help design as well as digitize social payment systems so that payments go directly into women's own accounts, so that they have control over that money. And we're hoping that by doing so, about 63 million more women will not just open a new bank account, but they'll be more empowered to decide how to save money, how to spend money, how to actually build a financial future. That final leg of our strategy, gender mainstreaming and integration, that's a really important one, and it's also a really tough one. Many of the organizations in the room today, I'm sure this resonates for you. I know there was a session this afternoon on looking at gender equality in the workplace. And here, we're trying to learn both from others as well as be thoughtful about the approach we bring to ensure that staff inside the foundation are equipped with the tools, the skills, as well as the energy to actually apply a gender lens to their work, to think about, no matter what sector it is, whether it's malaria or polio, vaccine delivery, vaccine development, financial services for the poor, agriculture, what does this mean from the perspective of men and women? How can we put the unique needs of women and girls at the center of the solutions that we drive? How can we consider the interests that women and girls have, even as we drive towards the impact that we're achieving in these sectors? I think in conclusion, achieving gender equality is something that I know there's a lot of energy on by probably the majority of us in this room today. It is probably one of the world's most significant and persistent challenges that is, evidence tells us, directly equated with actually challenging, changing the face of poverty around the world. There is nothing like actually taking a direct and targeted approach and moving from a very diffuse, complex model of solving gender inequality to a focused set of targeted solutions that will change the dynamics of inequality and poverty. Here, I think the voices of women and girls themselves are so important, and sometimes they're so invisible or so left out. And that's why I think that hearing from those voices and ensuring that we bring those voices into the primacy of what we do is so important. This past year, I was in India, and I met with a group of women in a small village in Bihar. And I was reminded a lot of the progress that we've made on gender equality. I was also reminded, frankly, of how far we need to go, of how persistent the gender norms are, and how they can hold back women and girls in the community. And that was the conversation we were having. Afterwards, one of the women, as part of this group, kind of came up to me on the sidelines. And she asked me a really important question. She said, "In your country, is everybody equal? In your country, are women perfectly equal to men?" And I looked at her, and all this, of course, is through a translator, and I looked at her and I said, "No. In my country, we're not there yet. Where I'm from in Canada, women are still paid 78 cents to the dollar. Women still shoulder a disproportionate burden of unpaid care and domestic work in the home. And gender-based violence is still pretty ubiquitous and cuts across economic and other identity lines. And that woman and I really looked at each other. We really got each other, and I recognized that her circumstances and mine were incredibly different, vastly different. And yet, we had this sense of understanding of the ways in which gender inequality touches so many of us, of how much progress has been made, but also how much more there is to do. When we address gender inequality, when we recognize that there's still no country that's achieved gender equality, that we have to take a targeted and focused approach, that we have to be tactical and intentional if we're really going to change the face of poverty. I think fundamentally we recognize that is what can unlock the potential for all people, for men and women, for boys and girls, to be equally valued, to have the same chance to live both a productive and a healthy life. I started off by talking about how one of the ways that we give up power is by not recognizing that we have it. One of the ways that we give up power is by not recognizing that we have it. And one of the ways that we don't share power is by not recognizing that every human being has value, that every human being needs to be equally valued, and that we need to, as part of that, tackle the underlying barriers that stand behind the face of poverty. I know that a lot of you are thinking about and are probably way ahead of us on this journey. These are some of the partners that we're working with as we take these next steps on our journey. And as we figure out what it's going to take to really realize this vision of changing the face of poverty. I want to make sure that we're extending our hands at the Gates Foundation to joining you as partners in sharing a vision of a world that is more equal, and recognizing that a world that is more equal is also a greater world. A world where when we remove the barriers for women and girls, we actually all benefit exponentially. Thank you so much for your time.